I'm a philosopher, and in my neck of the woods, everyone and their mother is writing a book about like wisdom from whatever tradition they are doing. So you have books coming out every day on like how to live well according to Montaigne, the Scottish Enlightenment, Chinese philosophy, whatever. And everyone's trying to like go somewhere else to try to find meaning and pull it into our world. And what I'm trying to do in the book is suggest that maybe the answer is already in the room. Maybe we already have a robust philosophy and we've already absorbed it, and we just need to double down on the thing that we already have.
And now, The Good Fight with Yascha Mounk.
My guest today is Alex Lefebvre. Alex is a professor of politics and philosophy at the University of Sydney, and he is the author of a book that I have really come to like and appreciate. A book published by a university press, but that is getting a lot of buzz for good reason, because it really deserves a broader audience. And it is called Liberalism as a Way of Life. In the book, Alex argues that we should recognize liberalism as one of the main philosophies of our age, not just when it comes to issues like free speech, issues like the kind of constraints we put on what the government gets to tell us to do, but when it comes to thinking about our friendships, our social relationships, what aspirations we should have in life, in the same way in which Christianity shapes part of the background of our culture. We should recognize that liberalism actually, to many people today, is the most important part of our background culture. I think this helps to provide orientation in a really interesting way. It also opens a bunch of complicated philosophical issues, such as whether embracing liberalism as a way of life may not actually buttress the critiques of anti-liberals who claim that they're being iced out of the public sphere, who claim that this broad notion of liberalism actually makes it impossible for them to pursue their own conception of the good. Alex and I, as you will see, had a really stimulating, really fun, really in-depth conversation trying to figure out how to think about those issues. Alex also draws inspiration from the work of probably the most significant political philosopher of the 20th century, John Rawls. And since we draw on his ideas a little bit in our conversation, I thought that this would be the right opportunity to give my listeners a real introduction to who John Rawls is and why it is that his work is so important to understanding our political moment, to understanding the political ideals that I think many listeners of this podcast, whether they would like Rawls or whether they would have disagreements with him, share. The conversation we had is, I think, a really good introduction to Rawls's work, both for those who have never read him and for those who are very familiar with it. So that part of the podcast is reserved for our paying subscribers. If you're one of them, thank you so much for supporting the mission and making this podcast possible. If you're not, you're missing out. Please go to yaschamounk.substack.com, become a paying subscriber, and get access to Alex's really brilliant introduction to John Rawls and to ad-free versions of all of the podcasts every week. Alex Lefebvre, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So there's a ton of things that I agree with in your book and was excited by in your book, and there's some interesting things that I think we're going to disagree on. But why don't we start with you making the case for liberalism in the refreshingly full-throated way that you do in the book? Why is it that you think we've in some ways been too modest about the achievements of liberalism, and in what terms should we celebrate it?
So I think that our liberalism runs a lot deeper than perhaps we are prepared to admit. And I think that's especially true for people who identify as liberals. So people who are card-carrying liberals typically think about it as a political kind of thing, an institutional kind of thing, having to do with such things as rights, division of power, constitutions, and the like. And the pitch I try to make in my book is that, in a sense, what the conservatives today say about liberalism is quite correct, that it has become a much bigger, much messier beast than we might suspect. And so what I want to propose in my book is I'm trying to suggest that a lot of us, our liberal values may run very deep in the sense that our liberal commitments may be at the heart of who we are. informing how we navigate all kind of different walks of life, from friendship, from romance, from parenting, how we are in the workplace, to the kinds of words we use and don't use, the kind of stuff we laugh at. All that stuff might be a liberal package. And so my book is a full-throated defense of liberalism, but I guess it starts at a prior question, which is like, where do we find ourselves today? And especially for people who aren't religious, where is it that we're getting our big values, our big moral ideals from? And my gambit is that liberalism is the thing that a lot of us should be pointing to.
So talk us through what that actually looks like, right? If you think that the values of people who aren't deeply religious are deeply set by liberalism, if you think that that really is what sets our moral compass, not just when it comes to whether or not you can ban somebody from saying something you don't like, not just when it comes to, how we think about the basic limits and what the state can do to us as individuals, but when it comes to those private interactions.
So, it's no surprise to anyone, but the biggest growing group of religious affiliation is today non-affiliation, right? So if you look at the category of religious nuns, people who tick the no religion box on the survey, they're growing more and more each year faster than any denomination. And in the United States, it's a rather low number, still a gigantic population of around 30%. You move to godless New Zealand, and it's clocking almost at 60% now. Here in Australia, it's around 50%. And so what I'm trying to do is, that's my audience. I'm trying to speak to people who don't have a prior religion that they can point to as the source for who they are. And the very first question that my book opens with is what I suggested is, I ask my reader quite plainly, quite bluntly, where do you, dear reader, get your values from? And I think we live at a really weird moment in time right now, where if you have a religion, that question is a piece of cake. You just go bang, you point to your church, your doctrine, your something like that, your spiritual community, no fuss, no muss. But really, you ask just anyone who is not religious that question, and they totally jam. They don't know what to answer. The first impulse I've asked a lot of people, I've done a lot of informal surveys here, and you ask someone that question, and their first impulse is to go to something hyper-local, like, I get who I have my values and my sensibility from my parents or from my experience or something like that. And that's perfectly fine. No doubt that shapes you, and that's crucial. Or else they point to something hyper-specific, like the novels of Marcel Proust or the films of whatever, Greta Gerwig or something like that. And again, cool, you're totally influenced by that thing. But of course, we live in these broader frames of meaning and of culture. And if we're not religious, then I think that the one that we've sort of pre-reflexively probably absorbed and adopted is this liberal framework, precisely because it is, and we can talk about this, and I'm keen to see, I suspect you do agree, but I'd like to hear it, that liberalism is the official hegemonic morality of our time. And it's sort of what we are bombarded with 24/7, especially for people like us who are born, 40, 45 years ago. We've just kind of grown up in those waters, and that's who we are now. And so what I'm trying to get liberals to recognize is how deep it runs, and also what we stand to lose if this moral paradigm is displaced, because I think it's more significant than a bunch of laws and protections, however significant those are. I think that we lose something deeply existential at that point.
So I'm trying to skirt around what I think is going to be the main issue of our disagreement, because I really wanted to lay out a little bit more of what I think we agree on, right? And just to give a gloss on this, I thought there was a kind of strange moral panic when Jordan Peterson first became really popular, 8 or 10 years ago at this point. And I always thought his popularity is our fault. And what I meant by that is that there was this huge lack of actual advice to people about how to live, right? That if you were a young man who was a little bit lost, a little bit unsure of what to do in life, and that was certainly initially sort of the main demographic that made him so popular and so successful, there just wasn't a lot of advice from good center left, or if you want good center right people, to say, hey, here is how you can lead your life. Here are virtues. Here is what is meaningful in your life. There was a lot of stuff in the background culture that I agree with you was, in some inchoate way liberal, but there wasn't very much self-confident proclaiming of this is our vision of what a good life is. And so he stepped into that vacuum. And I have my criticisms of him, and I particularly have my criticisms of how he's developed in the last years. But it always struck me that rather than blaming him for that, we should have been blaming ourselves for giving all of that space, precisely for the reasons that I think you outlined. Precisely because we were not willing to say, here is what we actually care about, and here is what a coherent set of liberal ideas about how to lead your life actually looks like. So tell us a little bit more about what that is. I think we've sort of been on a slightly meta level, right? What are these values that you think are hegemonic and that you think actually influence how we live in a way that perhaps goes deeper than the most obvious cultural products that are its product? I take it you're sort of saying, if you're Christian, you might say I'm influenced by C.S. Lewis, but you're going to be very aware of the fact that C.S. Lewis is himself a progenitor and a spokesperson for a much deeper tradition. Whereas if you're a liberal, you might say, you might pick a figure that is equivalent to C.S. Lewis, but perhaps there isn't really a C.S. Lewis equivalent figure in the tradition, which is itself interesting, but you wouldn't be aware that that figure itself is sort of the most eloquent explanation of a much deeper tradition that lies behind it. So what is that deeper tradition?
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, so there's a lot in that question. Let me start with the Jordan Peterson thing. I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, I don't know if there's a God-sized hole in our heart, but I do know there's a Christianity-sized hole in our culture. And nature, whatever, abhors a vacuum, and something's going to fill that. And Jordan Peterson was at the right time, at the right place, with the right demographic and the right kind of advice for that. I mean, Alain de Botton would be another kind of person who filled that gap, maybe kind of more century, didn't have that kind of pop sensation Peterson did. But yeah, there's all these kind of like casting around for meanings. And the big picture of my book is that, I'm a philosopher, I'm an academic, like you, and in my neck of the woods, everyone and their mother is writing a book about like wisdom from whatever tradition they are doing. So you have books coming out every day on like how to live well according to Montaigne, the Scottish Enlightenment, Chinese philosophy, whatever, and everyone's trying to like go somewhere else to try to find meaning and pull it into our world. And what I'm trying to do in the book is suggest that maybe the answer is already in the room. Maybe we already have a robust philosophy and we've already absorbed it, and we just need to double down on the thing that we already have. So that's the liberal tradition that I'm talking about. So you asked me about its top line values, and here I'm going to speak a little bit abstractly, but I'm going to go down a level to show what I mean in a moment. But if you had, we can play around the edges of what is the core of the liberal kind of commitments and values. But in my book and in my heart, I nominate three that I think are really at the center of this thing. One is a commitment to personal freedom, to my freedom, to your freedom. One is a commitment to fairness, and I'm very happy to go into what that means a little later. And the third is a commitment to reciprocity, in the sense that I matter no more than you, and you matter no more than me. And you take those three things together, freedom, fairness, and reciprocity, and you put them in a constellation, and I think you have something like liberalism. So those are typically seen as political values, underlying the principles underlying a bunch of our institutions, and all that's fine. But again, what I'm trying to say is that they descended into the background culture. So the quickest way, my best example that I have that can immediately appeal to a sense as to how we are liberal deep down, in this deep psychological sense I'm talking about, is, I talk about this in the book, but is the history of swear words. If you can give me a moment, that might sound a little odd or unusual, but just how we talk pre-reflexively reflects exactly what I'm talking about liberal deep down.
I love swear words on the podcast, so knock yourself out.
Perfect. Well, you love certain swear words. I'm sure I think there's another category you might not be so cool with. So let me get into it. So there's this great book written 10 years ago by an author named Melissa Moore, and it's this fantastic title. It's called Holy Shit, A Brief History of Swearing. And the title of that book is genius, because in those two words, holy and shit, what she does is effectively summarize the history of swear words over a 3,000-year tradition in the West. And her point is that different moments in times, at different moral and religious paradigms, you have a different kind of swear word that becomes ascendant. And why it's so interesting to track swear words is because you can very quickly, by finding out what a society thinks is bad and taboo and can't be said, you very quickly reverse engineer what its main moral commitments are. So in religious culture, it's of course swear words like oaths, sacraments, things like that are absolutely no-nos to say if you use them out of turn or in a bad faith. It endangers you, it endangers the community. So if you swear on the name of Christ or God, that's serious business. And other times when religion is less sacramental, when religion might be less important, shit words come to the fore. So obscenities, things about sex. So the Roman civilization was all about that. Their big swear words were around sexual passivity. And if you called someone a queer, or in Latin, that's to impugn someone for not being a manly, virile citizen, and that was like those were fighting words. And so then you get into the Victorian era, and it turns to all kinds of excremental words and sex words, okay, et cetera, et cetera. Now, You and I, you said you love swear words. Okay, yeah, no problem. I'm sure you love swear words. But you love the swear words that are safe to say. And we can say the holy and shit kind of words all we like on this podcast, and no one's going to bat an eye. But there's a different kind of word today that we were to say that would get your podcast in hot water and me fired within a week, which are, of course, slurs, right? Those are the truly unsayable words that we have today. Racial slurs, the N word being at the summa or the bottom of this pyramid, but also words around sexual orientation, disability, you name it. And the reason why slurs are the big no-no word today is because they impugn the self-respect and the dignity of all the people. So you and I don't think would dream of using slurs, like not in public, but like in private. We just don't talk that way. And so that's what I'm trying to suggest, that we've so absorbed certain liberal commitments that our liberalism runs right deep down to our bones in the kinds of words that we reflexively do and don't use. So that's what I'm trying to suggest by saying that it's gone all the way down.
There's a very interesting point that a historian once made, which is that, you're tempted to look at a book of manners as a straightforward guide to what people don't do in that society. But of course, a book of manners in many ways is a guide to what people do in that society. So if you look at certain late medieval or early modern books of manners, people will say, you really shouldn't be, burping or loudly farting at the table. And of course, that suggests that at the time, a lot of people thought that that was an appropriate thing to do. And there was an ascendant social class or ascendant set of manners that was saying, no, that's what we did in the past. That's no longer what we do. So in a similar way, you're right, where I am recording this right now in Tuscany, the go-to swear words, of course, they also have merda and things like that are equivalent to the most common American ones today, like shit, but a lot of them are very anti-clerical. And it's of course because Catholicism continues to be an important value in Italy. And so you end up getting words, like Dio cane, God is a dog, very common Tuscan swear word, that obviously is in conversation precisely, it's shocking not because people don't care about Christianity, but because Christianity continues to play an important role. So that's very interesting. Talk us a little bit through what those three values mean and why it is that they're specifically liberal. So when it comes to freedom, I think people understand why it might be instinctively liberal. I mean, the word liberal obviously comes from libertas, comes from liberty and freedom. What is it doing at the core of the liberal tradition, and how does fairness and reciprocity fit in, particularly when it comes to our daily life?
I'm very glad you brought up the origins of the word liberal. So a book that has really inspired me in this is Helena Rosenblatt's work, The Lost History of Liberalism. It's published by Princeton University Press about 5 years ago, and is just terrific because what it does is it goes into the word history of the word liberal and tries to see what it means right from go. So liberalism is a weird thing. So on the one hand, it's a very new political ideology. It's kind of the new kid on the block. It's 200 years old, which is like a newborn by the standards of intellectual history. So it started in resistance to Napoleon, early 19th century, and then it spreads for 200 years. But so new. But on the other hand, it is really old because the roots of the word go right back to Roman times. And the word liber, as you know better as well as I do, means a couple of things. It means on the one hand, freedom and the quality of being free and being a freeborn person. But it also means the quality or the characteristic of being generous and a generous person. And it's those two qualities that are at the heart of what liberalism means in its tradition. Now, I think for all kinds of interesting reasons that we can go into, we tend to forget one half of that equation today. We tend to really associate very quickly liberalism with liberty, and critics would say with individualism, with egoism, with selfishness, all that kind of stuff. But it's all pointing to the same kind of stuff. It's pointing to the freedom half of that equation. And we've tended to forget the generosity half. So that's the 20th and 21st century. So when liberalism is born in the 19th, though, those two ideas of being free and generous are really robustly connected. And the big question that I think animates almost all 19th century liberals, whatever their fascinating disagreements, whether we're talking the Frenchies like Tocqueville or Constant or Madame de Stael, or we're talking about the British tradition, where you got J.S. Mill and George Eliot, and all of them are asking, basically, they're all looking at the modern world, and they're freaked out by the modern world because they see so many new threats coming at our polities, but also at ourselves. And they're like, holy shit, the human being is under threat as never before. And their animating question was, how is it that human beings could remain, on the one hand, free, and on the other hand, generous, given all of these new pressures and temptations that the modern world is throwing at us? And the ones we still live with them. They're just everywhere. So the big ones that they were worried about were capitalism and how it not just threatens inequality, but it threatens to turn us all into nasty little consumerists who care only about our material satisfactions and pleasures. They were worried about nationalism and the closing of the mind in that sense, and they were especially freaked out by democracy, which is such a fascinating history. So today we think that liberalism and democracy are like peaches and cream. They're like two things you bring together in the picnic basket. They sit nicely, they play nicely together. But the reconciliation between liberalism and democracy took 200 years to achieve. That little hyphen is the work of 200 years of hard-fought negotiation and compromise on the part of each of those bits. Democracy had to give some, and liberalism had to give some. Because initially, liberalism was established in order to counteract all of the perceived dangers of democracy. So that's a very interesting long history.
Just to briefly sort of double down on that point, there remains to be just an essential tension between them, which is to say, and I argue this in the People versus Democracy, that of course, if you think of democracy as something like translating the preferences of the people into public policy, and you think of liberalism as something, among other things, as like constraints on what the state can do to individual citizens, that is the freedom element, those two things can come to be in tension when majorities of people persistently want laws and legislation and rules that constrain what individuals can do. When majorities of the people consistently vote, for example, political parties that say, we cannot tolerate that these people over there exercise their religion freely, or that those people over there get to say these blasphemous things, then there is going to be a real tension between those two elements of a political system. And at the same time, conversely, it's very hard, I think, in the long run, to maintain either element without the other. So once you start having a political system that is deeply illiberal, it's very easy for the government to keep in power because it controls the media, because there's control over the judiciary and so on. And conversely, if you have a sort of technocratic elite that guarantees certain kinds of freedoms, as was the case under military domination in Turkey until relatively recently, as is in the case in Singapore in certain ways, in order to sustain themselves, they're also going to limit the freedom of people, at the very least, to criticize them and probably to do other things as well. So the relationship between liberalism and democracy is very complicated because I think that they do effectively stand in tension. But resolving the tension is the only way to actually make sure that you keep both elements. Once you give up on one of them, the other becomes really vulnerable. So it's a really complicated relationship between them.
That's interesting. I'd love to pursue this more, not to turn the podcasting tables around, but so I think that it's a fraught relationship, but a necessary relationship. I think I agree. But I would want to say that the two can be freestanding. I just think that both options are pretty disagreeable. I think you can have an aristocratic liberalism, no problem. And so you had certain early historical liberals like Guizot, for example, is all about aristocracy. But you look at Singapore, for example, like something like we're a technocracy where you just have rule by elite expert. So you can have liberalism without democracy, I think, pretty easily.
Well, but go to Singapore and really start criticizing the governing political party. You're quickly going to come up against the limits of the liberalism.
I think that's right. Sure. I'm happy to. I don't know what exactly I'm committing myself to here, but I'm ready to agree that and somewhat you push too hard and you not only lose the balance, but you lose the concept that you're trying to preserve.
Certainly, I think that there's demi-liberal regimes that are not truly democratic, that can sustain themselves over time. And Singapore is certainly the most impressive case. And it is in many ways a very impressive place. But there's always going to be some limits on the liberalism there, precisely because a liberalism that doesn't rest on popular support will need some illiberal means to sustain itself.
I think that's right. Yeah. So back to the question. This is a pleasant detour. What was the question?
So I think you were in the middle of talking us through the three sort of core values of liberalism as you see them today. And you were still, I think, on liberty. But then, I'm also curious about fairness and reciprocity.
So where we find ourselves today is that we've inherited a liberal tradition that in so many respects privileges freedom over all equalities. And what I want to try to do is remind, and not that it needs reminder because it's a vast tradition, but to insist again on the essential connection between the notion of freedom and of generosity. And the thinker that does this for me most powerfully, and the one I draw in on my book, is John Rawls. And the way he bridges those two ideas, so sometimes I might slip between the idea of generosity and fairness, but fairness is the concept that he uses really to try to talk about the liberal morality of our times. And so Rawls is such a terrific thinker for me because I think he really speaks to us directly, and not of our political world only, but of kind of who we are today in our hearts. So Rawls was the great 20th century political philosopher. Worked at Harvard all of his career, and he wrote his magnum opus, A Theory of Justice, published in 1971. And that book puts the idea of fairness right at the heart of a liberal morality. And so why I draw on Rawls so much is I think he's not just a great political theorist, I think he's a superb moralist in the sense that he's able to see what our moral commitments are and try to insist how to make us the best version of ourselves. So what Rawls does in this philosophy is he looks around his contemporary United States and he looks at all of its major public documents, all of its major public institutions, constitutions, the judicial speeches, those kinds of things. He's looking around, and he's trying to identify what at the end of the day is the fundamental moral commitment of all of this stuff around us, the public face of the morality of our culture. And he digs and digs and digs, and he finds this one concept which he names fairness. And he says that we in a liberal democratic society, and this is the fundamental proposition of Rawls, and I inherit it from my book as the fundamental proposition of what I think liberal morality is that society should be a fair system of cooperation from one generation to the next. And so that is the very baseline of what Rawls does. And then what he does in his work is he generates this tremendously complicated political philosophy with all of these. So Rawls invents 1,000,001 technical concepts to flesh this out, but he's always just trying to see what this idea of fairness demands of our societies and of ourselves. And in the book, what I tried to do is flesh out a little bit more what it demands of ourselves, especially once these ideas have ceased to be just kind of political stuff, but have gone into a much broader cultural framework. So, Yascha, you made a great point about how the two components of liberalism and democracy need to be held together for either of them to be coherent. Let me take that and sort of displace it a little bit laterally and make the same point with freedom and generosity. So in freedom and generosity as the two liberal ideals, those were just wed together in the 19th century. But what happens in the 20th century is a very interesting history of how liberalism retrenches itself and sort of walks back its vision, especially of generosity, or loses sight that that was ever part of its tradition to begin with. So there's a great many interesting moments in the history of 20th century liberalism when we can point to that liberalism, in a sense, lost something valuable itself. And I want to say that liberalism lost its mojo in different kind of stages in the 20th century. So a very important first moment was the invention of the term classical liberalism. So we think of classical liberalism as like Locke and kind of some of the 19th century people, but early liberals never called themselves classical. Like, what would that even mean? That would be ridiculous. It would be like the inventors of skateboarding calling themselves old school. Like, it just that doesn't happen. They're creating the tradition as it goes along. So what happened is that it was early 20th century thinkers, free market types, Chicago types, the Hayeks, the Beckers, the Friedmans, who looked around at their early 20th century society, and particularly the New Deal and its social provision, and they were freaked out. They thought it was proto-totalitarian. They thought it was too socialist. So what they did is they reversed engineered a tradition that they called classical liberalism, and that insisted on personal freedom and market freedoms, and that they claimed themselves to be the true inheritors of. Now, whether or not they were right to do that, it was definitely a tactical and a polemical move, and it directed liberalism more towards the freedom rather than the generosity aspect. Fast forward a few more decades, and this is something that Samuel Moyn has written beautifully about in his book, Liberalism Against Itself. But you have another reinvention of liberalism in the Cold War, and this is when liberalism was particularly terrified of these gigantic collectivist movements. The Nazism, of course, but really the clear and present danger was the USSR. And they were terrified of its aggressive statism, but they were also very scared of its perfectionism in the sense of upholding certain ethical models of self-realization for citizens to be a certain way. And the Cold War liberals said, no, that's so dangerous. What we have to do above all, the liberal tradition must stand for the protection of the individual against the state. And so you have the liberalism of fear, you have the liberalism of individual rights, the negative liberty stuff. All of that, again, is bringing liberalism back to something more modest for good reasons, again. Last episode in this very interesting trajectory is political liberalism, which is, I think, the mainstream canonical vision of liberalism in Anglo-American political philosophy today, inspired by Rawls's very late work. And the idea there is that the main job of liberalism is to design inclusivist political frameworks so that people with different conceptions of the good life can live in a flourishing, happy happy society. So you have a Jew, a Muslim, a Kantian, a Cheyan, an atheist, whatever. You create a framework by which all those people can cohabit with each other and for the right reasons. Now, again, all that's very understandable. We live in these pluralist society, and that needs to happen. But again, liberalism lost a vision of itself as ethically robust. So what a lot of kind of liberals now are scrambling, right? There's all these new challenges to liberalism, and we're having to try to reinvent the doctrine. So we're reaching for the past to try to find inspirations, not to impose old visions, but to see what resources the tradition has. And what I'm trying to do in my book is insist on a certain vision of generous and free living and how it can be revived for us today, especially for us who basically can profess no other values because we've been born in this liberal world.
So one of the key debates among communists and socialists in the second half of the 20th century was a battle between the young Marx and the late Marx. After rediscovery of some of Marx's earlier writings, the student revolutionaries of the 1960s, for example, used the young Marx in a way as a battering rod, not just against bourgeois liberals, but also against their own more orthodox late Marxist teachers. I fear that the rest of this conversation is going to be a battle between the young Rawls and the old Rawls, in which I'm going to be taking and ventriloquating the part of the older Rawls. So John Rawls has a key shift in his thinking. We don't need to go into the details of this. But the way that I understand Rawls's mature philosophy, he says broadly something like the following, and some of this is in the young Rawls as well, right? Which is that when you're reflecting on how to build a just society, what he calls a fair scheme of social cooperation, one of the fundamental things you realize is that people have very, very different notions of what makes a good life. Some of us in society, and this is particularly true in ethnically and religiously diverse societies, but it's also true in seemingly more homogeneous societies, that some people are going to be very devout. They think that a good life is to live in accordance with what scripture tells you. Other people may be completely agnostic or atheist, right? They think that, developing their talents and having interesting experiences is really important. Or they think, I'm not religious, but, really spending time with my family and being a family man and raising my children, that's really what's important in life, right? And so there's a fundamental question about the legitimacy of a state power, which is a question which predates modern liberals. A fundamental question about how it is that the police and the laws and the president and the prime minister can have any kind of power over what I should do. And particularly, if we all lived in one homogeneous moral community where we're committed to the same ideals, that might be less of a problem. But if we live in this kind of society where I might have very different notions about what's worthwhile than them, that's going to be a huge problem. And so John Rawls's answer to this, and we can have a conversation about how deeply rooted that is in the liberal tradition, I think it's rather more deeply rooted than you suggest, is to say, look, when it comes to how our politics is structured, we need to have a political liberalism, which is to say we need to have a set of rules and procedures for which we can gain assent among people with very different kinds of moral and religious views. We can have an overlapping consensus where even if I am a devout Catholic, I say, you know what, I can live meaningfully in that society. And the fundamental part of that is the freedoms that we give to everybody, right? Is to say, well, you have freedom of speech, you have freedom of worship, you have freedom of assembly. Even if a majority of the population really dislikes your religious congregation, you have a right to congregate with each other and to be true to your religion. And so you can have a thriving Amish community in the United States whose moral values and whose vision of life is radically different from that of the median American. But they're able to do that because of political liberalism, because of the space that we give them. Now, to me, that is a fundamental answer not to the Cold War, as somebody like Sam Moyn would argue. And I can see how it's inflected in some ways by the concerns of Isaiah Berlin about what positive liberty would lead to. But it really comes from the historical origins of liberalism, which lie in good part in the religious wars of these pretty homogeneous societies in early modern Europe that had the same ethnic identities, that had the same gender identities, that had the same historical roots, but in which parts of the population had listened to Martin Luther and radically changed how they think about theology, and parts of the population had not. And that led to decades and centuries of warfare until these societies were able to adopt something like a political conception of liberalism, which allowed them in Germany today, which has a lot of Protestants and a lot of Catholics, and many European societies and around the world, to live next to each other peacefully. Now, one of the ideas of political liberalism is that you can, of course, have very different substantive notions of a good life. And those can be Catholic, those can be Protestant, those can be atheist, those can come from many, many different traditions. I think where I find your work incredibly valuable is on the insistence that one of the kind of comprehensive doctrines that can and should flourish in that society is a liberal one. And we should be much more full-throated about articulating that as one of a kind of moral visions that is available to people in this society. We shouldn't be worried about that. We need many more people, this was my point about Jordan Peterson, who provide alternatives to these other comprehensive doctrines by actually saying, hey, you're a slightly lost 20-year-old trying to figure out what to do in your life. Let's not just have Buddhism as a way of life and Catholicism as a way of life and Jordan Petersonism as a way of life. Let's have liberalism as a way of life. Let's tell you what, from a liberal perspective, you might think is valuable in your life. But for me, it's very, very important that we distinguish between the political notion of liberalism that has to remain neutral between these different substantive visions of life and the comprehensive liberalism, which is one candidate among others within society that should compete for people's affection and endorsement, but in terms that are equal. And I think the reason why that's so important is that we need to take the challenge from post-liberals seriously, which is to say the people who are saying, look, this political system claims to be neutral. It claims to allow for everybody to live as they want. But in fact, it doesn't leave this space for religious people to have a meaningful life. In fact, it doesn't allow people who don't get on board with the comprehensive doctrine of liberalism to have the same opportunities to develop their form of life. And I think that for their dreams of domination are chimerical. The idea, for example, that the United States is going to be ruled by some form of Catholic integralism defies any understanding of the empirical facts of the United States of America today. We are also chimerical if we think that we are going to be living in a peaceful, liberal, democratic society unless we make really sure that people whose comprehensive doctrines are not liberal do actually pertain to this overlapping consensus, do actually feel that they have a genuine place in the society to live as they wish. And on that, I think there's some mistakes that we make. There are some particular laws and some particular social customs that I think do in fact marginalize them in ways that we should be self-critical about. But like you, I think we can actually be very proud of our record. Look at the flourishing Amish community in the United States. I mean, what a testament is that to the liberal tolerance? I think that is the best argument against the post-liberals. But if we start to say, hey, you know what, they're kind of right, liberalism is a comprehensive doctrine and does reflect everything we do, that to me seems to open the door very wide to their arguments winning the day.
This might be too liberal an answer, but I think the young Marx, the old Marx, the young Rawls, the old Rawls, they can get along here. So let me pitch this way. So I am a political liberal in exactly the way you describe. I do definitely think I'm not a perfectionist liberal, by which I mean that I do not think that the liberal state should promote either with its power or with its purse a certain way of life that is illiberal for all kinds of ways, and exactly what you said, because in a liberal democratic society, public power is accountable to its citizens, and if it can't be justified in terms that the citizens themselves can accept, it's not right. There's something really fishy, if not straight up unjustifiable about such an exercise of power. So we're totally on the same page. But here's my beef with political liberalism. All political liberals that I read, whether that's the founders and Lamore and John Rawls, or you get John Mounk, all of them are basically committed in one assumption that they make, which is that everyone living in a liberal democratic society is, let's say, liberal plus something else. So they believe in liberalism, they uphold the Constitution, all that stuff, equal rights, blah, 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 fine, but they're also something else. And the something else is that they're Christian, that they're Muslim, that they're Jewish, but there's always a composite identity between liberalism and some other form of identity. And they don't allow for the notion, they don't entertain the notion that someone's liberalism can run all the way down into them. And that's what my beef or my complaint with political liberalism is. It obscures what I think is the major morality of our time, because a whole bunch of people aren't liberal plus something. They're just liberal all the way down. And I'm not saying the state should force that harm. Of course not. What I'm saying is that we need to recognize empirical reality for what it is. And that if you ask the random person on the street who doesn't profess religion where they get their values from, you poke and prod enough, and then they're just going to start saying liberal stuff, and you'll see how deep it is. So that's my complaint. So I definitely am a political liberal. I don't think you should. But on the other hand, so this is what so now we come to the post-liberal bit, and this is a very interesting thing. So I think the most interesting post-liberals, I'm thinking here particularly of Adrian Vermeule, their complaint against political liberalism isn't that it's wrong, it's that it's irrelevant, that the state can pretend all of its neutrality all it likes, but basically the state has subcontracted in their view all of its dirty work, all of its cultural promotion, all of its turning liberalism into this liturgical sacramental doctrine. It's subcontracted all of that to civil society, such that anytime we switch on Netflix, anytime we watch YouTube, if you use a dating app, whatever, you're just in a liberal bubble all through and through. And so the liberal state then gets to kind of like hypocritically have its cake and eat it too. It says, no, man, I'm totally neutral. Let a thousand flowers bloom. But when you actually look at the actual operation of civil society and its powers of culture and of consensus, you see it all the way down robust liberal monoculture at that level. So the state doesn't have to get its hands dirty. And so here I have some sympathy for the liberal kind of regime, the post-liberal regime change kind of paradigm. They're saying, I feel that there's a concession by a lot of conservatives that they've lost the culture war in a deep way, that the horses bolted 30 years ago, and that the only way in which that they can recover their culture and recover a space in which they think their way of life can thrive is by using the state in an illiberal perfectionist kind of way. Let's call it Catholic integralism, let's call it whatever, but for the state to start promoting aggressively a particular conception of the good life. And obviously you and I are going to say that's bad, that's wrong, but on the other hand, I can't help but feel sympathetic that they've lost the culture war, and so they have to do a move that liberals don't have to, because we're hegemonic. They have to say, okay, we have to start using the state to do this cultural work because otherwise we're done for. So I'm at once abhorred by them, and I totally get it. How does that scan for you?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot we agree on. You are also putting your finger on something that is, I think, the fundamental empirical incoherence of that project, which is to say, you can say, hey, we have lost control of civil society, so let's get control of the state. But the question, of course, is, well, how did you get control of the state? If you are a Catholic in the United States, which is the minority religious denomination in the country, and the vast majority of Catholics are meaningfully Catholic, but not in any way wanting to live in a theocratic state, how on earth do you actually propose to take control of a state? So as a pure political strategy, it's always struck me that this is a lot less realistic than the alternatives that are available to people, which is, if you don't like Netflix, build your own media company. And actually, I think that in some ways, that political space is quite successful at doing that at the moment. And that may be a good thing. That may actually make people feel like they have somewhere within civil society to go. Now, where I am a little bit sympathetic to that is the distinction between a organic victory of liberalism and ways in which we are using illiberal means within civil society to impose some of those values. And that is a liberal concern that goes very far back, right? When you read John Stuart Mill, as you very well know, in On Liberty, he says the greatest threat is the social tyranny of society. That if you express a political view or a moral view that they find to be not to their liking, they're going to exclude you from social life in such a crushing way that it breeds a great homogeneity. Now, at the time, Mill was probably mostly thinking of views that we would now consider liberal. He, for example, was an early advocate for the equality of women in ways that got him mocked and ridiculed in large parts of London society at the time. But I think he and I think we as liberals should also extend the same sympathy for views that may be rooted in religious foundations and so on. So for me, the problem is not, is civil society by and large in many ways liberal? That is the part of a culture that I feel comfortable in. That is, I certainly am both a political liberal and somebody who subscribes to the private liberal morality that you're talking about in many ways. I recognize myself in that completely. And I think as a theoretical point, you make a very important contribution. But I think we have to be very careful that we don't use illiberal means in order to impose that private liberal morality on others. And that's where we come to concerns about cancel culture, to concerns about how some of these institutions privilege the majority voice over the minority voice, over the voice of a moral or religious minority, and so on. Now, to me, that is important to recognize, because the post-liberals are going to say, there's no way of doing that. The boat has sailed. There's no space for us anywhere in the culture. So therefore, we need to go and take power in the state. That's our only hope. I think that there are ways within a liberal civil society to leave that space, but that will in part take us liberals not to be overly triumphalist, us liberals not to be overly, to be generous in victory.
No, okay, yes. Okay, this is exactly what I wanted to say. So the way this conversation has taken the shape of it is that as if I'm writing my book to try to speak to the conservative critics. I'm absolutely not trying to speak to the conservative critics. My only engagement with them is to say, hey, they're actually really right about something, which is the scope of liberalism today. My real addressee are fellow liberals like me who profess no other value system. And the pitch of the book is to try to get us to live up to our own values. And so one of the great heroes of the book is Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish theologian, 19th century. And just bear with me 1 minute, it'll be relevant immediately why this is important. But he was just one of the most astute social critics of the 19th century, and he's in strong company here with people like Marx and Baudelaire and Nietzsche and all those greats. But when Kierkegaard walked around his native Copenhagen in the 19th century, he saw that everyone was professing the good Christian life. There was a Lutheran church on every corner. Everyone was high-fiving each other, congratulating themselves on their piety. They went to church, et cetera, et cetera. But then he really looked at these people, and he's like, oh, shit, you guys are not Christian. Nothing of your authentic desires speaks to Christianity. Really, you guys are basically bourgeois Philistines. You want a roast on Saturday, some quiet pleasures, social respectability, a mistress on the side. That's what you want in life. And there's just this big cosplaying, this big masquerade of being Christianity, being Christian. And he had a word for that. It was just so damning and perfect and elegant. And he called the state of that society Christendom. And in Danish, that word Christendom means playing at Christianity. It means literally Christian-ish. Christianness. So I don't think that we live in Christendom anymore. I think that that moment has passed, but I definitely think that we live in liberaldom. And so that's my word that I try to coin for a society that talks the liberal values, but doesn't walk the liberal walk, that just professes these pieties of fairness and generosity and freedom, blah, 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 blah. But then we try to duck taxes all the time. We try to lavish our kids with unfair advantages. We weaponize speech and try to cancel people if they deviate slightly from the party line. And so all of those ways are in which we are illiberal. So when Kierkegaard wrote, Kierkegaard wasn't trying to convince the Muslim to become Christian. Kierkegaard was writing to convince the Christian to become Christian. I'm writing not to convince the conservative to become Christian, not for the conservative to become liberal, but for the liberal to become liberal. And that's the whole point of the book. So the book is really not, I really don't want to give the impression that this book is about flattery or celebration, or that we've arrived at the end of times and that we should just all kick up our feet and bask in the liberal way of life. I'm trying to suggest that this way of life is deep, it's demanding, it's also very rewarding, and it is up to individuals on their own and concertedly to try to live up to it as best they can. And I want to try to suggest that there are real joys, pleasures, and felicities that come from doing so.
So I think many of the listeners to this podcast probably do think of themselves as liberal, and they now probably wonder whether or not they are complicit in this form of liberaldom. So what would it mean for us as a society, and what would it mean for me, for you, for all of our listeners to be more genuine, more authentic, more real liberals, rather than ones that simply pay lip service to those moral ideals?
So I think that a main thing is whether a lot of your day-to-day behaviors support fairness in some really simple way. Look, you can we live, of course, in compromised societies and with deep inequalities, but there are certain things that we do here and now in our day-to-day lives that are definitely illiberal. And they're definitely not that we're breaking the laws or anything, that we follow laws that are tilted constantly and to our advantage. And we benefit from them all the way and live the hypocritical kind of way. So I'll kind of confess my great sin. It's not like it doesn't set, I won't set it up so grandly. It's that I sent my daughter to a private school here in Australia. Now, if I think about that for a moment, I don't think I can square that with my liberal commitments. I'm taking her talents, I'm taking some revenue out of the public system, and then putting it into this other thing, which will lavish generational advantage on it, generating all this meritocracy business that we know and hate and love and participate in. And I think all of us do subtly game the systems in that way. We file for taxes. We try to claim any deduction we can. We treat others ungenerously. We always try to assert our privileges and prerogatives above those of others. All of those are liberal things that we can't square, and they just insinuate themselves into our day-to-day behavior. So what I'm trying to say is that I think a liberal morality is as demanding as storied as Christianity, and we have to call ourselves out for not living up to it. Now, the book isn't scolding. I'm not trying to say that you're a bad liberal. That's not at all the point. What I'm trying to do in the book is I'm trying to furnish readers with reasons as to why they might want to adhere to their liberal values. And so I outline all the kind of pleasures and joys and what I call felicities. I call the perks of living a liberal way of life. And I think there are a great many. I think it's joyful, it's cheerful, it's redemptive in some important way. It leads to all kinds of wonderful ideas like being more impartial, more autonomous, more free. So that's the pitch that I'm trying to make.
Alex Lefebvre, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. After we recorded this, Alex and I also had an in-depth conversation about the life and the work of John Rawls, with Alex making the case for why Rawls is key to understanding what we're up to in our politics and culture, how to think about how to be a good liberal in 1971 when A Theory of Justice was published, or in 2024 when you're listening to this. To get access to this part of a conversation, please head now to yaschamounk.substack.com and become a paying subscriber. Thank you so much for listening to The Good Fight. Lots of listeners have been spreading the word about the show. If you too have been enjoying the podcast, please be like, rate the show on iTunes, tell your friends all about it, share it on Facebook or Twitter. And finally, please mail suggestions for great guests or comments about the show to goodfightpod@gmail.com. That's goodfightpod@gmail.com.
This recording carries a Creative Commons 4.0 international license. Thanks to Silent Partner for their song, Chess Pieces.